Hi, everybody. I'm very pleased to share with you a moment of the Japanese history, namely the beginning of aviation in Japan. My presentation today will be divided in 5 parts. First of all, the first flying man, then balloons and airships, the father of Japanese aviation, the first laps, first circuits, and then the rise of Japanese aviation. In Japan, kites were the first object to fly. According to Cecile study, these appeared in Japan in the 18th century during the Nara era. They became really popular in the 7th century. During the Edo period, kites were hobbies for adults before they became children's entertainment. And in a kabuki work by Namiki Gohei, the hero, Kakinoki Kinsuke, would have used a giant kite to transport himself on the roof of Nagoya Castle in 1712. He stole the golden scales there of Sachihoko, and this event indicates the will to raise the sky like Icarus, who stuck his wings behind his back to escape from the labyrinth of Daedalus. The first Japanese who flew during the Edo period were called Ukita Kokichi and Asato. Ukita lived in Bizen. He would have studied pigeons, measuring their weights, sizes, and wingspan. Then he would have calculated the ratio of all these results to his own weight and built wings which he fixed at his chest level. He climbed on a roof or on a bridge, we really don't know, and started flapping his wings before throwing himself into the void. He only succeeds in crashing in the middle of a meal during the Hanami celebration. The fall of Ukita frightened the guests. Although entertaining, his exploit was described as illegal and he was sentenced to exile. The dates of this performance vary once again according to the sources, but we can say that it would have taken place between 1785 and 1789. This character would indeed have existed and was baptized the Birdman, Chojin in Japanese. At the same time, in the prefecture of Okinawa, Asato is said to have developed a device enabling him to flap his wings with his foot. The exact number of his flight is not known, but the expression Tobi Asato, flying Asato, was coined to pay homage to him. Balloon and airships flights were the next step. The 18th century officially marked the beginnings of balloon flights in France. Men could finally move from the dream of flying to reality. As the French soared in the air in the Parisian suburbs, were the Japanese aware of ballooning techniques? On November 21st of 1783, the Montgolfier brothers balloon with passengers on board left the Bois de Boulogne and covered 9 kilometers in 25 minutes. The news of the balloon flights arrived in Japan 4 years later through the Dutch residing in Dejima. It was around 1787. This balloon became the object of numerous and articles until the development of military uses at the beginning of the Meiji era. In the 1890s in Japan, the National School of Engineering and the Army jointly designed a balloon for military use. But repeated test failures made these studies laborious, and the succession of setbacks would be an explanation for understanding the backwardness of the Japanese in this era. Perhaps this is why the authorities decided to acquire balloons abroad. Balloon flights became popular in Japan thanks in part to translation of works by Jules Verne. They could be found in magazines for teenagers such as Mars World, Sekai, or the Young Japanese, Nihon Shonen. The first translation of these works dates from 1878 and was Around the World in 80 Days. These readings weren't the only ones to amaze Japan. strangers did much to arouse their curiosity. Indeed, in 1890, English and American balloonists arrived in Japan. From September to December, Percival Green Spencer and Thomas Scott Baldwin performed using balloons. A series of images representing these shows was compiled in illustrated magazines. A Japanese man stood out in this area and more particularly in the airship sector, and his name was Yamada Isaburo. In 1894, he worked in a company specializing in the manufacture of inflatable lifeboats. The army ordered an aerostat envelope from this company, and Yamada was no stranger to the world of ballooning because he had worked on a cylindrical shape of a hot air balloon as an amateur. To meet the demand of the army, he was inspired by his personal project and created Yamadashiki No. 1, influenced by a German model. This first device was 18 meters long, supported such a long nacelle and a 12-horsepower engine. At that time, efforts in aeronautical research became more and more intense all around the world. Organizations were set up in different countries. The Aero Club of France in 1898, the Royal Air Club of Great Britain in 1901, and the Aero Club of America in 1905. On July 30, 1909, the Extraordinary Association for the Research of Balloons in Military Use was born in Japan. Its purpose was to promote research in the aerostation sector and later in the aeronautics. Before embarking on projects to manufacture balloons, airships, or entirely Japanese airplanes, this aeronautical association became interested in foreign aerostats and more particularly in the German airship named Percival. It was 75 meters long and could fly for several hours. It was renamed with a Japanese name, Yuhi, and Japanese airships were manufactured in the early 20th century, but Japanese aircraft cannot be distinguished precisely from foreigners because of the Japanese names systematically given to foreign machines. The association sent a team to Germany to deepen and improve the knowledge of Japanese engineers. In 1912, an airship was transported by sea to Japan and assembled by German technicians in Tokugawa. Unfortunately, the object struck an obstacle and then became unusable despite all the efforts made by the German engineers. It was scrapped until 1915. The Japanese Aeronautic Association, which was at the origin of this project, did everything to repair it, but an accumulation of technical difficulties slowed down the repair of this machine. Furthermore, collaboration with the Germans was called into question because of the rapprochement of the Japanese with the Allies during the First World War. The time for military balloons on airships seems to end at the end of 1920s. Little by little, more efficient flying machines were born and offered amazing possibilities to engineers. The aviation era had just begun. The Japanese have always turned to the best specialists in the world before designing their own machines. The industrial world was linked to the soldiers who placed orders for it to manufacture its machines. But a new flying machine would revolutionize the global airline industry. Apart from Yamada, Japan doesn't seem to have known any real inventor in the field of balloons or airships. What about the aviation community? For France, we can cite Jean-Marie Lebris, Clément Ader, Louis-Charles Breguet, Louis Blériot, and so many more. But the West was full of pilots and engineers at the very beginning of the 20th century. In Japan, the aeronautical pioneer is called Ninomiya Chuhachi. His observation of nature will provide an opportunity to understand how it inspired him to create his inventions. It doesn't seem stupid to suggest that he would have been the pioneer of world aeronautics without the breaks that will be discussed. The presentation of his studies, then the development of his models, will reveal the different stages of his approach. Ninomiya Chuhachi was born in the prefecture of Ehime in Yawatahama in 1866. This city is located on the west coast of the island of Shikoku, and his father was a merchant who sold fish and other seafood. Ninomiya, on the death of his father, had to find a way to support himself and finance his education. He was a child whose curiosity was visibly insatiable, and this trait of character will follow him all his life. During his apprenticeship period with a pharmacist, he would have immersed himself in books of pharmacology, chemistry, and physics. He would also have looked at ancient Chinese and Japanese works to hone his thirst for culture and knowledge. At the same time, he made and sold kites. These toys came in all shapes and colors, and they're very successful and sold easily. Some of them ended up being called Chuhachi kites. Unfortunately, there is no trace of these two fragile objects. Presumably, the experience acquired during the manufacture of and the flight of these toys enabled Ninomiya to implicitly understand the four principles of flights, which are, remind you, traction, drag, weight, and lift. In the 1880s, Ninomiya lived in a country in full transformation. And I would like to make a short parenthesis to tell you about the Meiji era. It is a political period marked by the end of the old social status, the opening of the country to external influences, and an accelerated modernization of society. One of the symbols of this era is the development of new means of transport. The first railway line connecting Shimbashi to Yokohama was inaugurated in 1872. To this was added a new aspect of the urban landscape inspired by the Western model. And this current of Westernization hardly reached Yawatahara. Clothes, haircuts, and hats changed. But beyond fashion, the means of transport were also experiencing an impetus of modernization. Ninomiya, curious by nature, felt the greatest interest in the face of all this innovation. One can imagine his amazement at the speed of the trains freshly installed in the archipelago, and whose first lines were operational in his native Shikoku in 1888. During a trip aboard a steamship, he was explained how the propellers of the boat work. In Japanese ports, these steamers were more and more numerous. Bikes and cars were gradually taken over of the streets of cities. It was in this rapidly changing context that Ninomiya entered a school for penniless young people. He always made his kites to pay for his lessons, and like everyone else, he had noticed that birds and insects flew with flapping wings. Hot air balloons went up without the help of flaps. They rose in the sky thanks to the heated air trapped in the canvas envelope. And what about his kites? No wing, no hot gas. He would have deduced that these objects use wind or air to hover like a boat would float on water. With all this observation, he wanted to get into the design of balloons. But the gas was very expensive and only available in Osaka. That would have dissuaded him, and he would have contented himself with making kites, which he perfected. Then the time had come for Ninomiya, then he was 20 years old, to do his military service. In 1887, he entered the 12th Manugame Infantry Regiment in the department of Kagawa on Shikoku Island. Too small to be part of the troops, he successfully passed the entrance exam to the health department of the regiment, probably thanks to his training in the pharmacy a few times before. In 1889, during maneuvers on Mount Ryoyo, during a break, he observed ravens coming to peck at ground near the soldiers. He watched their wings on their way in the sky with the greatest attention. His drawing tells us that he had observed the flight angle of the birds. He noticed that ravens didn't flap their wings constantly. Indeed, after takeoff, they reached a flight level and placed their body horizontally and hovered as if carried by the wind like its kites. Ninomiya observations, made as an amateur, were a real feat for the time. He had in fact broken down each flight stage, the movement of the bird's wings, and this physical phenomena. And this sketch of this work can also be seen at the Hiko temple. This is the flight of the raven. After careful examination of nature, Ninomiya had integrated and scientifically understood two principles of flight, lift and resistance. The higher is the wind velocity, the easier is the flight. Ninomiya understood the importance of the wind thanks to the manipulation of its kites. Without wind, kites could not rise in the sky. To test this hypothesis, he didn't hesitate to jump from a bridge with an umbrella to physically feel the resistance to the air and identify the forces at play during the fall. Watching birds and insects no longer satisfied Ninomiya. Fascinated by flight, he began a construction in 1890 of a flying machine in the form of a reduced model. He believed that humans couldn't fly with flapping arms because the physical and muscular structure of human being was not adapted to effective wing flapping, like Devancy centuries ago. Like most aeronautical engineers, he also studied the flight of insects, including dragonflies. These insects, with an elongated body, have two pairs of wings that do not fall. The dragonfly always has its wings spread, and Ninomiya concluded that the stability of this insect flight was due to the position of its body. He was not limited to these animals and began to examine animals with membranes allowing them to soar, the squirrel and the frog. The flying squirrel has a membrane between the anterior and posterior paw. Thanks to the deployment of this patagium, the squirrel is able to glide from tree to tree over a short distance in order to escape from predators. The flying frog, on the other hand, has a very developed web around its fingers, which allows it to make gliding jumps. Thanks to this work, Ninomiya was able in 1890 to design the first machine flying in the sky of Japan. He then divided his time between his military duty, his studies in pharmacy, and his dreams of flying one day. He drew hundreds of sketches relating to the flights of birds and insects. The engineers had created boats to sail on the waves, trains to go faster and faster, but despite numerous scientific advances in various fields, we could not yet fly freely like birds. Ninomiya was familiar with Western technology and technical advances through objects imported in Japan, such as the gas lamp, train, bicycle, or telephone. But even in these distant countries, no one had apparently yet developed a safe flying machine. Going up and down in a hot air balloon did not satisfy him anymore. Growing Japan's interest in balloon flights and the growing number of press articles seemed to support Ninomiya's development of a man-controlled flying machine. He wanted to exceed the constraint of the wind and wanted to invent a flying controlled machine. At the same time, he was very interested in the flight of Bamboocopter, this traditional game that the Japanese call taketombo. Ninomiya understood that the phenomenon of the toy's ascent looked like the propulsion of a steamer propeller. To be more pragmatic, the lift on the propulsion of this Bamboocopter are provided by the spinning of the propeller. This consists of two blades. And what would be the consequence on the flight if its propeller had four blades? He focused on the movement and operation of the propellers on steamships. The marine propulsion system provides the best thrust from an engine. Ninomiya had understood that the steamers progressed on water thanks to the rotation of the propeller generated by the power of an engine. He remembered, indeed, the explanation received on the operation of these propellers of steamships during a trip. If he had adapted this rotation system to his flying machine, he was convinced that he could fly his machine. But what he didn't know was that water doesn't behave like air. Water doesn't compress. This is why the shape of the propellers of boats is not identical to that of current planes. But Ninomiya didn't yet have this modern mechanical knowledge. On the other hand, what he had anticipated was the use of a means of propulsion, the propeller. In 1891, Ninomiya finalized his model. Its main wing was monoplane with a positive dihedral, and the wing spin of its model was 45 centimeters and was 35 centimeters from nose to tail. He also fitted his machine with an horizontal tail unit at the rear and a vertical stabilizer on the nose. He used materials identical to those necessary for kites, such as bamboo and Japanese craft paper. For the propeller, Ninomiya found a solution by working enough on a wooden board to make it thin, light, and solid. Another concern imposed itself on the inventor: how to rotate the propeller. He found the solution by wrapping a rubber cord from a stethoscope around the propeller and then fixing it between the nose and the tail. He observed that the rubber returned to its original shape even after being twisted. The question of driving had to be settled. He had to find a way for his machine to pick up speed before taking off, like the bird running before taking off. He then thought of using wheels like bicycle wheels to run his machine and installed three, one at the front and two at the rear. Finally, he painted his model all in black with two eyes on the nose. This was supposed to look like a raven, source of his inspiration. He had to think of a name for his invention. He then thought of the term hikouki, which is translated by airplane, after having calligraphed characters on a sheet of paper. Hikouki is made up of three characters that can be translated simply like fly, go, and machine. This term is still used today, and he baptized his first model made in 1891, Raven plane model Karasuke Hikouki. On April 29th, 1891, his plane took off from a military training ground in Marugame. He flew about 10 meters. After several attempts, it ends up flying over a distance of 36 meters. As the shape of its creation resembled that of our Crayon planes, and that it had flown, one can conclude from it that it was theoretically in the truth, and that it had made fly the first plane in Japan. That's why April 29th in Japan is the Japan Aviation Day. Ninomiya then imagined creating a machine transporting men, a new means of transport. he embarked on this new task. He had to go from the size of the model to that of a machine on a human scale. In October 1893, he built a new machine, this time imitating the flight of an insect. After observing, comparing, and classifying different species of insects, he selected the beetle. This one has two pairs of wings. The top wings cannot fold, and during the flying, it opens its hind wings widely, thus leads on the air. The upper wings protect the lower wings during flight, and Ninomiya called his new machine the beetle plane, Tamamushi Hikoki. It was a 2-meter wide model, primarily to a machine allowing a human being to fly. Its form was different from that of its first project. It was a tailless biplane, and this ship with two pairs of wings reminded that of the insects from which it was inspired. The lower wings was smaller than the one above and was supposed to help get the machine. The curved top wing provided air resistance, and the only common point with the Raven plane was the 4-blade propeller. The propeller of this initial project was inspired by a Bamboocopter. That of the beetle plane was more like a boat propeller. The only real problem was the source of energy to run it. The mechanism of the elastic would obviously not provide enough power to fly passengers over a long distance. He attempted to attach a 12-horsepower engine to it, identical to that of some airships or newly imported motorcycle engines. But it turned out to be too weak in power. This crucial point held back Ninomiya's ambition to fly pilots for several months. Ninomiya's aeronautical project, although incomplete, fit perfectly into the political context, but unfortunately remained unknown to decision makers and strategists. Ninomiya, while working in the infantry health service, sensed that this invention could be used in reconnaissance missions just like the balloons. Confident of the success of his plan, he decided to ask the army for financial and material assistance. In 1894, he therefore sent a letter with a sketch to Colonel Nagaoka Gaishi and to the brigade chief Oshima Yoshimasa. Nagaoka Gaishi flatly refused to act, too busy with the ongoing military affairs. This officer didn't leave then the potential and the revolutionary aspect of this machine. Ironically, Nagaoka shared the Aeronautical Association in 1908, and in 1918 he became the vice-president of the Imperial Aeronautical Association. In the same year, after writing a new request, Ninomiya had to face the officer's skepticism once again and was again refused. He left the military in 1895 and returned to his home province in Shikoku. He continued his research alone, without support, with his own savings. On December 17, 1903, the Wright brothers successfully launched a machine in America, in the states of North America at Kitty Hawk. Their first flight lasted barely 12 seconds. The two Americans decided to hide their invention for fear of being stolen because of a patent race in the West. Their exploit was not known in Europe until a few months later. 10 years before, Ninomiya was on the verge of having his flying machine. He abandoned his research as soon as he learned of the success of the Americans. An Agence France-Presse article dated April 29th of 2003 presented Professor Noguchi's findings on Ninomiya's work. This professor of aerodynamics then declared, if he had had a powerful enough engine, Ninomiya would have flown before the success of the Wright brothers because he was 12 years ahead. Ninomiya's main problem was the lack of funding for his project. Noguchi said the only engines over 12 horsepower available in Japan were imported from America and were extremely expensive. According to him, it was necessary to pay 500 yen to get one when the salary of a policeman did not exceed 12 yen per month. Noguchi continues. He developed his ideas on his own when he didn't know anything about science. He wanted to fly from childhood and just watch nature. In 1921, Japan paid tribute to him. Nagaoka Gaishi, who had rejected all his requests for funding, wrote him a letter of apology. And the same year, General Shirakawa Yoshinori studied the work of Ninomiya and recognized its great value. Ninomiya is now recognized as the father of the Japanese aviation, and he died in 1936 at the age of 70. From 1906, flying machines crisscrossed the occidental sky. They flew faster, further, higher, and Oshikawa's magazine reported on all Western aviation exploits. In November 1909 issue, an article mentioned the improvement of flight controls for Blériot-type aircraft, and another one related in detail the course of the Reims competition. At a meeting in Reims in 1910, a Japanese Navy officer and a physicist from Toda University were sent as observers. In June 1910, villages of Champagne and their wine yachts welcomed thousands of spectators from around the world during an international air meeting that lasted a week. The presence of two Japanese people at one of them shows Japan's growing interest in these new technologies. Other Japanese were in France at the same time, two young pilots, both belonging to the army. There were Tokugawa Yoshitoshi and Hino Kumazo. They were sent to Paris region to learn to fly and to make Japan catch up in aeronautical sector. The two young men not only had to learn to drive, test different machines and buy the best performing ones while being able to repair them if necessary. On April 11, 1910, Tokugawa and Hino went to Shimbashi Station. They took the train to Tsuruga, and from there they took a boat to Vladivostok, and then they traveled on the Trans-Siberian Railway for 2 weeks, crossed the continent, and finally reached Paris. Tokugawa Yoshitoshi, born in Tōkyō, and he came from the famous Tokugawa family. His father was linked to scandals and contracted debts, which led him to lose his title of count in 1901. Yoshitoshi lived in a famous but fallen family. One wonders if his enthusiasm for the emerging aeronautical world was not linked to the desire to restore the coat of arms of his family. Tokugawa and Hino went to Étampes in Henri Farman's flight school. There were only 2 school planes at this facility. One plane was for learning to fly, and the other was there in the event of an accident. The learning of this machine was short and had to be effective. The instructor stood behind the student pilot. He placed his right hand on the student to guide him with the pressure of one hand. This was how the direction of the aircraft and the power of the engine were adjusted. But students could also sit in the back, right hand over the instructor's shoulder, to feel the flight and master the machine. 5 minutes of individual technical interview completed the theoretical part of the training, and some could benefit from a flight simulator. The study pilots only made 10 flights of a few minutes. They repeated the gestures and finally controlled the gases and the flight techniques in a rather summary manner. After having made 3 solo flights, Tokugawa obtained his license on November 8, 1910, and is the first Japanese to have obtained this kind of flying permit. Tokugawa's mission in France was to confirm the effectiveness of aircraft during combat phase and not just as an observation craft. At the same time as his training, he worked jointly with employees of a Mitsui company and the Japanese ambassador. Together, they visited aeronautical factories and French engine manufacturers. Ultimately, Tokugawa acquired a Farman 3 biplane, which it shipped to Japan. As for Ino, in 1909, just before leaving on a mission to Europe with Tokugawa, he had consulted and studied foreign documents relating to the aviation field and had finally manufactured an airplane with his own money, as Ninomiya had done about 20 years earlier. He baptized it Hinoshiki No. 1 and he built it in just 3 months. Like Tokugawa, Hino began flying in the Farman School, but left the French establishment in July and went to Germany without notifying his superiors. He went to the Berlin airfield for 3 months. Why did Hino choose Germany? It is not absurd to think that Hino was attracted to this country, which had inspired the Japanese in the field of ballooning and which also carried out aeronautical research. Hino's goal was the same as Tokugawa's, learning emerging aeronautical techniques and buying a high-performance aircraft, and he bought a Hans Grade. Hino and Tokugawa returned to Japan on October 25, 1910, and after only a few months of training in Europe, on their return to Japan, Tokugawa and Hino demonstrated their flying skills at an air show. It was organized in mid-December 1910 in Yoyogi Park, then a military training ground. Many spectators gathered to admire their prowess. Memorials to these flights can still be found today near the west entrance to the park. The air show program was spread over a week from 11th to 19th of December and detailed the daily tasks: setting up, assembling the aircraft, inspecting the machines and the runway, starting the official flights, and then disassembly the machines. On December 17th and 18th, 1910, the weather was not at all favorable. The flights were therefore cancelled due to a strong wind. On December 19th, 1910, at 7:50 a.m., Tokugawa took off, circled the military field at 70 meters high, over 3,000 meters in 4 minutes. This flight was recorded as the first in Japan, and it was decided to make this day of December 19th official. Tokugawa developed his aeronautical activities in Japan and became the head teacher of the Tokorozawa Flight School years later. In addition, he conducted studies on long-haul flights, and 7 years later, Tokugawa earned the title of Baron, earning the lost honor of his family. As for Hino, he spent the rest of his career as a consultant in a factory manufacturing fighter jets and became very interested in rockets. Let us fast forward in a little and speak about Japanese aviation in the 1930s. Japan has taken barely 20 years to build the foundations for a solid and modern air arsenal. In the early 1930s, civil aviation included 200 aircrafts and about 400 pilots. Since the end of 1929, a dense network had been operating, including the following lines. These connections were provided by the following main companies: Japanese Institute for Research on Air Transport, Nihonkoku Yuso Kenkyūjō, the Company of Regular Flights between the regions of Kanto and Kansai, Tōzai Teiki Kokukai, and a company sponsored by the Asahi newspaper. Here is now the evolution of air routes between 1932 and 1936, and then 1936 to 1939. In 1937, the pilots of the Asahi newspaper, I've told you just before, made it possible to carry out a remarkable report for the time, since they carried out a world record of long-haul flight between Tokyo and London in order to photograph the coronation of King George VI on May 12, 1937. The journey lasted 94 hours and 17 minutes aboard a Mitsubishi named Kamikaze. And the stages of this journey were as follows: Taipei, Hanoi, Vientiane, Calcutta, Karachi, Basra, Baghdad, Athens, Rome, Paris, and then London. What is interesting to note is that Japan was, with Thailand, the only country in Asia to have established an aeronautical industry in the 20s. These two countries have not been colonized by Western countries, and these colonizing countries were not particularly interested in developing routes within the colonies. On the other hand, they were all in favor of setting up means of transport to and from their nations. Thus, the British facilitated an air route to India, the French to Indochina, and the Dutch to Indonesia. The skies of the Far East were then served by many European airlines, such as Imperial Airways, Air Orient, or KLM. Japan therefore had free rein. In addition, aeronautical engineers were developing machines that were more and more efficient in terms of speed and distance traveled. Note that civil aviation appeared sometime after military aviation. Technological advances benefited both. National airlines were created during these periods. Regular lines allowed travelers to discover their country more quickly. The planes were soon used to transport passengers, but also press articles, reports, and mails and parcels. The Japanese airmail post appeared in 1929, finally very shortly after the French aeropostale. International trade in the aviation sector increased from this time. Less than 2 decades had passed since the flight of Tokugawa and Hino. 20 years will have been enough in Japan for its aviation to appear, grow, and become reliable and powerful. Japanese engineers and soldiers were strongly inspired by the devices and the technology existing in Europe. Early aircraft manufacturers produced machines similar to those that flew in the West. They manufactured the planes under foreign licenses and patents. Then they designed them under their own certification. To show its progress to the world, Japan launched in 1920s a challenge to the various aeronautical manufacturers to develop a long-haul aircraft capable of crossing the Pacific. Passenger airlines were set up in the 20s to travel across Japan, but also to China or Korea. These overhead lines were installed almost at the same time as lines in the West. Japan seemed to progress at the rate of its model of the beginning of the 20th century. The press played a significant role in the development of this means of transportation. Indeed, it praised the merits of pilots and machines. In addition, thanks to aeronautical engineers and technicians, Japan would conquer the sky to make the Allies shiver during the Second World War, but this is another chapter in history. Thank you for your attention.
This video is not ended. Please let your questions or remarks in comments. We will be glad to answer them. Subscribe, like and share to help us making this channel well known. See you soon!